The Grand Conclave of the Galactic Sovereignty was the most powerful room in the known universe. It floated above the neutral world of Velkara like a crown of metal and light, a station so large that entire warships could dock inside its outer ring. Without touching the walls, every species that mattered had a seat inside its main chamber. More than 200 civilizations sent their best minds and sharpest tongues to argue, vote, and shape the laws that governed every star system in the galaxy. Humanity had a seat too. It was in the lower chamber. The lower chamber was where the sovereignty put species that were not quite trusted, yet species that were admitted, but not really welcomed, species that were given a place at the table, but never allowed to touch the food. Humans had held that seat for decades, and every year the message from the upper chamber was the same. You are here because we allow it. The Velnorathi Dominion ran the upper chamber. They were tall creatures with silver skin and 4 arms and eyes that could see into wavelengths of light that humans could not even measure. They had held the top seat in the sovereignty for 300 years, and they wore that history like armor. Their ships were the biggest, their fleets were the fastest, their word, in every official sovereignty meeting, carried the most weight. And they had grown very tired of humanity. Humans were messy, they were emotional, they argued too much and apologized too little. They built cities on worlds that other species considered sacred. They asked questions that were considered rude by every diplomatic standard. They formed friendships with species that were supposed to be enemies of each other. They refused to respect the natural order of the galaxy, which, to the Velnorathi, was very simple. Strong species ruled, weak species obeyed. Humanity kept refusing to understand which category it belonged to. The decree of erasure had been discussed quietly in Velnorathi government halls for many years. It was not a new idea, it was an old idea that finally had enough votes behind it. The decree stated 3 things very clearly. First, humanity's provisional membership in the galactic sovereignty was to be permanently and irrevocably revoked. Second, all human colony worlds in 12 contested star systems were to be seized by sovereignty administrative forces and repurposed for redistribution among senior member species. Third, the planet Earth itself was to be placed under sovereignty oversight, meaning that an alien administrative council would take control of human government, human policy, and human affairs, until such time as the sovereignty decided humans were ready to govern themselves. The vote was held on a Tuesday morning by Earth's calendar. It passed with 173 votes in favor. 14 species abstained. 3 voted against. Humanity was not allowed to vote on the matter because provisional members did not have voting rights in the upper chamber. Ambassador Lyra Chen sat in the lower chamber gallery and watched the result appear on the massive display screen above the voting floor. She was 44 years old, with dark hair pulled back tight, and a face that had spent years learning not to show what it was thinking. She read the numbers once, she read them again. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked to the speaking podium. This was not strictly allowed. Provisional member representatives were not supposed to address the upper chamber without formal invitation. The hall monitors moved toward her immediately, but something in the way she walked made them slow down. She did not look like someone who was about to beg. She did not look like someone who was about to cry. She did not look like someone who had just lost. She looked like someone who had just been given permission to do something she had been waiting a very long time to do. The chamber went quiet without anyone asking it to. 200 species, 10,000 representatives, 1,000 camera drones broadcasting live to every corner of the galaxy, all of them watching one human woman walk to a podium she was not supposed to stand at. She placed her datapad on the surface. She looked up at the chamber. She did not look at the Velnorathi representatives specifically. She looked at everyone. Then she spoke. "You have made a terrible and irreversible mistake today." That was all she said. She picked up her datapad, she turned around, she walked out of the chamber. No appeal, no negotiation, no tears, no raised voice, no dramatic speech. The door closed behind her with a soft sound, and the chamber sat in complete silence for almost 30 seconds, which, in political terms, was an eternity. Then the laughing started. It began in the Velnorathi section and spread outward like a wave through water. The Gret Holly delegates, who had 6 mouths each, used all of them. The Shivani cluster representatives buzzed their wings in the pattern that their species used for amusement. The feed hosts on 1,000 worlds started talking over each other, trying to describe what they had just witnessed. One woman, 9 words, and exit. The most watched political moment in galactic history, and it had lasted less than a minute. The commentary was immediate and almost entirely mocking. Human news feeds were flooded with alien broadcasts, calling it the most embarrassing display of diplomatic failure in sovereignty history. One popular Velnorathi commentator said on live broadcast that humanity had just proven what every senior species had always suspected. They were children playing at being adults. Back on Earth, the reaction was different. The feeds picked it up fast. People in cities across every continent watched the clip of Lyra Chen's 9 words and her walk to the door over and over again, and something strange happened. They did not look scared. In government buildings and military installations and research centers and quiet office rooms in places that did not appear on any public map, people watched that clip, and then they got to work. Because they had been waiting for that moment too. They had been waiting for it in a very different way than the galaxy understood. Admiral Desmond Acaffer watched the vote result come in from the Sol Defense Command Center, buried 3 kilometers below the Sahara Desert. He was a large man with gray at his temples and hands that had spent 30 years learning every piece of human military hardware ever built. He watched the number 173 appear on his screen. He opened a drawer in his desk. He took out a single physical key card, the old-fashioned kind. Because physical keys could not be hacked through a network, he held it for a moment. Then he picked up the communication terminal next to his desk, the one with no wireless signal and no satellite uplink, the one connected only by a hardwired fiber cable running directly to 7 other terminals in 7 other hidden locations across the solar system. He spoke 1 sentence into it. Confirm receipt of threshold authorization. 7 voices came back, one after the other, each calm, each professional, each saying the same word. Confirmed. Acaffer put the keycard back in the drawer. He did not use it, yet there was a process, and the process had to be followed correctly. 40 years of preparation did not get thrown away by rushing the final step. He pulled up a map of the galaxy on his screen. The map was not the official sovereignty one, it was humanity's own version, built over decades from their own deep space surveys and intelligence networks. It had things on it that the sovereignty did not know humans knew about. He looked at 19 points on that map. He thought about Lyra Chen's 9 words. Then he closed the map, folded his hands on the desk, and waited for the Velnorathi administrative fleet to begin moving toward human space. Because that was the signal. Not the vote, not the decree, not the broadcast. The moment their ships moved was the moment everything else began. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the edge of the solar system, in locations that appeared on no official chart and no treaty document, things that had been sleeping for a very long time began to wake up. The galaxy had a very clear picture of what humanity was. It was a picture built over decades of watching humans stumble through diplomatic meetings, argue with each other on public broadcasts, launch missions that failed spectacularly, and then try again with barely any pause in between. The picture showed a species that was young and passionate and occasionally clever, but fundamentally limited ships, limited firepower, limited reach, limited patience. It was a very detailed picture. It was also completely wrong. The Velnorathi administrative fleet began moving toward human space 4 days after the decree of erasure was passed. It was a fleet of 60 vessels. Not warships exactly, but heavily armed transports and command ships built for exactly this kind of mission. The kind where the other side was not expected to fight back. The Velnorathi fleet commander, a senior officer named Grath Velan, had done this kind of operation before 3 times. He had led administrative seizure missions against smaller species, and 3 times the species in question had opened their ports and stood aside because what else could they do? He expected this to be the 4th time. He was on his bridge, reviewing the route to the first human colony system, when one of his sensor operators made a sound that was not part of normal operations. "Commander," the operator said, "I am reading movement in the outer zones of the Sol system." Grath Velan looked up from his charts. "What kind of movement?" "Large scale, sir. I am reading drive signatures, but the configuration does not match any human vessel class in our database." Grath Velan walked to the sensor station and looked at the data himself. He looked at it for a long time. He was an experienced officer. He had seen a lot of sensor data in his career. What he was looking at did not make sense. Not because the readings were unclear. They were very clear. What did not make sense was the number. He was reading 412 separate drive signatures emerging from locations in the deep outer belt of the Sol system, not 37, which was approximately how many ships humanity was allowed to operate under the treaty, not 100, which would already have been a serious violation, not 200. 412. And the configurations were not anything in the Velnorathi database, because they had never been seen before by anyone. 40 years ago, a human engineer named Yara Mossad had written a paper that was classified the same day it was finished. The paper was titled simply, "The Problem with Being Watched." It argued one central idea. If the sovereignty was watching humanity's official shipyards and humanity's official fleet numbers and humanity's official military budget, then those were the things humanity should make sure the sovereignty kept watching. Everything else should happen somewhere else. The midnight shipyards were not on any official chart. They were not in any system with a sovereignty monitoring station. They were built in the deep dark between star systems in the cold, empty spaces that nobody ever looked at because there was nothing there to look at. Except there was. The first yard was finished 29 years ago. It was small, just capable of building frigates and mid-sized support vessels. But it was the beginning, and the beginning was enough. The yards expanded slowly and carefully, one chamber at a time, one dock at a time, each new section powered down completely, if any sovereignty survey vessel came within 2 light years. Over the decades, the program grew. It did not grow because humanity's government ordered it to grow in a single dramatic moment. It grew because thousands of engineers and officers and administrators and scientists made individual decisions to contribute to something they believed in. They believed in it not because they were told to, but because they had watched their ambassadors get laughed at. They had watched their colony applications get denied. They had watched the sovereignty assign them a seat in the lower chamber. And they had thought the same quiet thought. Not forever. The ships that emerged from the midnight shipyards looked nothing like what the sovereignty expected human ships to look like. They were not large and slow, and built for transport the way treaty-approved human vessels had to be. They were compact and fast, and built around a weapons philosophy that human engineers had developed by spending 40 years studying every alien weapon system they could find, breaking them down, understanding them, and building something specifically designed to defeat them. The drone swarms were a separate program entirely. 200,000 autonomous combat drones, each one smaller than a civilian transport shuttle, each one carrying enough firepower to destroy a vessel 3 times its size, had been sitting in deep storage containers scattered across the outer asteroid belts of 6 different human-controlled systems. They had no crew. They needed no crew. They operated on systems that human AI researchers had spent 15 years refining specifically for combat coordination. They were already moving by the time Grath Velan finished looking at his sensor data. Director Nadia Volkov of the Sovereignty Intelligence Division received the first field report from the human border region and read it twice before she believed it. She then called 3 of her senior analysts into her office and made them read it too. "This is not possible," one of them said. "I know," she said. "The treaty limits human fleet tonnage to." "I know what the treaty says," she said. "Read the sensor counts again." He read them again. He put the report down. He looked at her. "How long have they been building?" "Based on the scale of what we are looking at," she said, "I believe they started before the treaty was signed." The room went very quiet. The reckoning protocols were a set of documents that lived in a vault beneath Sol Defense Command. Each protocol was a complete and detailed war plan written for a specific scenario and a specific opponent. There was a protocol for a war against the Velnorathi Dominion. There was one for the Grethali Federation. There was one for the Shivani Cluster and the Orvani Trade Collective, and 17 other major sovereignty members. Each protocol had been written by a team of specialists who spent years studying nothing but their assigned opponent. They studied military history, biological vulnerabilities, economic dependencies, communication infrastructure, psychological pressure points, and political fault lines. They did not write these plans because humanity wanted war. They wrote them because a species that had no plan was a species that could be destroyed, and humanity had decided a very long time ago that it would not be destroyed. Admiral Akafer pulled Protocol 1 from the vault at 300 hours Earth time. He read through the first 12 pages, even though he had read them hundreds of times before he did this, because he believed in doing things properly, especially when the thing being done was going to change the history of the galaxy. At 400 hours, he sent a single encrypted signal to 19 locations. The signal contained 4 words: "Execute Protocol 1 now." The Velnorathi administrative fleet was still 14 days from the first human colony system when 19 simultaneous operations began in 19 different star systems, all in the same hour. Not one after another, the way wars usually started, one engagement, one response, one escalation at a time. All of them at once. Because the humans had not studied the galaxy for 40 years to fight a conventional war, they had studied it to end one before the other side realized it had started. Grath Velan received the first emergency signal from Velnorathi Command 17 minutes after the operations began. He received the second emergency signal. 4 minutes after that, he received the third, fourth, and fifth signals in the next 10 minutes. Then communications from home went dark. He stood on his bridge and looked at the silence on his communication board and felt something that he would later describe to investigators, in the weeks when there were still investigators to speak to, as a very specific and unusual kind of fear. Not the fear of being attacked. The fear of realizing you had been wrong about everything, and that the window for doing something about it had already closed. He gave the order to stop the fleet's advance. It was the right decision. It was also, by that point, completely irrelevant. Every species in the galaxy understood war. War was something all advanced civilizations had practiced at some point in their history. It had a shape to it that everyone recognized. Fleets met in open space and exchanged fire. Territory was contested, and then taken or defended. Supply lines were cut, and then restored. Ground forces moved across colony worlds. Negotiations happened when one side's losses became too heavy to continue. Then a treaty was signed, and everyone went home with new borders and old wounds, and the next generation grew up studying the conflict in school. War had a grammar. Every sovereignty species knew the grammar because they had all used it at different points in their past. Even the Velnorathi, who were now the dominant power in the galaxy, had fought wars by the grammar. They had won most of those wars, but they had fought them in a way that the losing side could at least understand. Humanity did not fight by the grammar. The 19 simultaneous operations that began in the first hour of what would later be called the Reckoning War were not aimed at military targets. 12 of them targeted communication relay stations. The relay stations were the nervous system of the sovereignty. They were how fleets received orders, how governments talked to each other, how intelligence moved from one part of the galaxy to another. They were not military installations, they were administrative infrastructure. And under the grammar of war, you did not attack them first. You attacked ships, you established military dominance, you then dealt with the rest. Humanity attacked them first. The remaining 7 operations targeted supply depots and fuel distribution networks that served Velnorathi fleet operations, not the fleets themselves, the depots. A Velnorathi fleet that could not receive orders and could not refuel was not a threat. It was a collection of very expensive metal floating in space, and humanity did not need to destroy expensive metal. It just needed to make sure that expensive metal could not do anything. Within 48 hours of the war's beginning, 6 Velnorathi fleet groups had gone completely silent. They were not destroyed, they were just disconnected captains who had not received orders in 2 days and could not reach command, and were running fuel calculations that told them they could not reach any operational depot without resupply, were doing the only logical thing. They were not fighting. They were waiting for information that was not coming. Senior Commander Velsharath of the Velnorathi High Command called his intelligence chiefs into a room and asked them a question that he had never expected to ask in his career. What are humans actually doing? The intelligence chiefs looked at each other. They are not taking territory, sir, the lead analyst said. I can see that. What are they doing? They appear to be dismantling our ability to operate. Sir, without destroying our assets directly, they are targeting the systems our assets depend on. Velsharath looked at the map. That is not how war works. No, sir, the analyst said. It is not how we do war. The distinction sat in the room for a moment like something heavy. The sovereignty held an emergency session 12 days into the conflict. It was not a calm session. Representatives from 40 species spoke over each other. In the first hour, 3 separate procedural challenges were raised, and ignored underneath all the noise was one question that nobody wanted to say out loud clearly, but that everyone was trying to answer. How bad is this going to get? The Human Psychological Warfare Division had been sending quiet private transmissions to the governments of every sovereignty member species that had voted for the decree of erasure, but had no direct military alliance with the Velnorathi Dominion. The transmissions were not threats, they were not ultimatums, they were polite, and they were precise. Each transmission was addressed specifically to the government receiving it. It used that government's own language. It acknowledged the specific reason that government had voted the way it had, whether that reason was political pressure from the Velnorathi or economic incentive or simple indifference toward humanity. It did not lecture, it did not condemn. It said one thing. This conflict is between humanity and the Velnorathi Dominion. It does not need to involve you. You have 72 hours to file a formal abstention with the Sovereignty Record Office. If you do not file an abstention, your ongoing participation in the decree of erasure will be treated as active support for the Velnorathi position. We will remember who stood where. 41 governments filed abstentions within the 72-hour window. 11 more filed within the following week. The Velnorathi, who had voted through the decree with 173 votes behind them, watched their coalition collapse from the outside, in like a building with the foundation removed. Nobody declared support for humanity. Nobody announced they were switching sides. They simply and quietly and very firmly stopped being involved. The Sovereignty Emergency Session that had been called to organize a collective military response to humanity's actions ended without a response being organized, because the votes required to authorize a collective military response were no longer there. Velsharath received the news in his command center. He read the abstention count. He looked at his aide. "They planned this," he said. "Yes, sir," the aide said. "Before the decree passed." "Almost certainly, sir. The transmissions were too prepared, too specific. They had information about each government's internal politics that takes years to gather. They were not written in response to the decree. They were written in preparation for it." Velsherath sat with that for a moment. "How long have they been planning this?" The aide did not have an answer because the honest answer was too large to say comfortably. 40 years was the answer. 40 years of quiet intelligence work, of human agents embedded in alien diplomatic circles, of patience that no sovereignty species had ever credited humans with because humans were loud and emotional and impatient. And that was the image of humanity that the galaxy had built its assumptions on. Nobody had thought to ask whether the image was the point. The military engagements that did happen in the early weeks of the war were brief and deeply unsettling for Velnorathi commanders. The human ships that they had never seen before moved faster than any vessel their database had on file. They did not engage in the extended broadside exchanges that made up the bulk of conventional space combat. They made precise strikes at specific systems, not at the ship as a whole, and then pulled back before a full counter-engagement could form. One commander described fighting them as trying to grab water. Another sent a report back to high command, in the brief window before that relay station went offline, saying that the enemy appeared to know the exact internal layout of Velnorathi warships. He was correct. The reckoning protocols included full schematics of every Velnorathi vessel class, obtained through intelligence work over many years. Human weapons had been specifically calibrated to breach Velnorathi hull configurations at the weakest points. They had not stolen this information recently. They had been collecting it for a generation. The Sovereignty Special Session on Day 19 voted to formally request that humanity enter ceasefire negotiations. The motion passed with a large majority. The Velnorathi voted against it. Ambassador Lyra Chen, speaking from a secure human diplomatic channel, responded to the session's request with a single written statement. Humanity entered this conflict because the sovereignty passed a decree that stripped us of our sovereignty, our territory, and our right to self-governance. We did not ask for this. We will discuss terms when the Velnorathi Dominion acknowledges that the decree of erasure was unlawful and agrees to full restitution. Until that acknowledgement is on record, we have nothing to negotiate. The Velnorathi did not acknowledge it. And so the war continued, and every day the Velnorathi found fewer allies willing to answer their calls and fewer relay stations functioning, and fewer supply lines running, and their fleets, which were still enormous and still powerful, sat in space like fists with no arms attached to them, waiting to throw a punch that the geometry of the situation would not allow them to throw. The galaxy watched, and the galaxy was very quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Not the quiet of peace. The quiet of watching something unfold and beginning to understand, slowly, and with growing discomfort, that the outcome had been decided before the first shot was fired, and that the species doing the deciding had been in the lower chamber all along. Arvith Prime was not a famous world. It did not have the history of Earth or the strategic importance of the large colony systems closer to the Sol region. It was a mid-distance colony, settled about 60 years ago by a mix of mining families and agricultural workers who had wanted space, and found it there. The planet had wide flat plains good for growing food and deep rock formations good for pulling minerals out of, and the people who lived on it had built their towns around both of those things. 2.3 million people lived on Arvith Prime. Roughly 400,000 of them were children. The Velnorathi High Command had been meeting in emergency session for 11 consecutive days when the proposal was first raised. It was not raised by a young officer acting without authority. It was raised by one of the most senior members of the High Command, a strategist named Vorkathel, who had spent 40 years studying how wars ended. "We cannot defeat their fleet directly," Vorkathel said. "We cannot restore our communication networks fast enough to coordinate a proper counteroffensive. We cannot rebuild our supply chains, while their drone units are active in our resupply corridors. We are not losing this war in space, we are losing it in infrastructure and in politics, and in the simple fact that they prepared for this and we did not." The room was quiet. "So we change the terms," he said. "We do not try to match them militarily, we do not try to outmaneuver them tactically. We find the thing that breaks them. We find the thing that makes their population demand their government stop. We make them feel a cost they are not prepared to pay." Another officer spoke. "You are talking about civilian targets." "I am talking about ending this war," Vorkathel said. The debate that followed lasted 4 hours. At the end of those 4 hours, the vote was taken. It passed. The strike on Arvith Prime was carried out by a small, fast Velnorathi task force that had been operating in an isolated part of the frontier, disconnected from the broader command problems that had been plaguing the Velnorathi fleet. The task force commander received his orders through one of the few still functioning relay stations and executed them without delay because he was a military officer, and those were his orders. The bombardment lasted 9 minutes. What it did in those 9 minutes could not be undone in 9 years. The emergency signal reached Saul Defense Command at 2:17 hours Earth time. It hit Admiral Akafer's terminal before it hit anyone else's, because his terminal was set to receive Arvith signals first. He had put that setting in place 6 weeks ago, when the war began, because he had read Vorkathel's published tactical papers from before the war, and he had known what kind of thinking the man was capable of. Akafer read the signal. He read the casualty estimate. He sat in his chair for a long time in a very still way. Then he stood up, he walked to the communication terminal, he opened a channel to 6 specific people in 6 specific locations, each of them a senior commander with authority over a different section of the human war effort. He did not raise his voice. He had never once in his career raised his voice in a command setting. He did not start now. "Arvith," he said, "confirm receipt." 6 voices came back. "Confirmed." "Broadcast confirmed to all unit commanders," he said. "Authorization granted for full unrestricted engagement. All operational limits, except Category 7, are lifted. Commanders have full discretionary authority. Acknowledge." Category 7 was the bioweapon designation. The vault stayed sealed. They would always stay sealed as long as Akafer had authority over them, because there were lines that humanity had decided, in long and serious conversations years before this war, that it would not cross regardless of what the other side did. Everything else was now open. The change was immediate, and it was total. Human fleet units that had been operating under strict rules of engagement, designed to minimize collateral damage and avoid the appearance of aggression, now operated under no such restrictions. The drone swarms that had been deployed in careful targeted patterns shifted to area denial configurations. The Velnorathi systems that human forces had been carefully avoiding, because they were civilian infrastructure, were no longer being avoided. The Velnorathi had hit a civilian world. Humanity was going to make sure they understood exactly what that decision had cost them. The 6 weeks that followed the strike on Arvith Prime became known by a short name across the galaxy: the 6 weeks. Nobody who lived through them forgot them. Nobody who studied them afterward fully understood how they were possible, because the scale and the speed and the precision of what human forces did in that period did not match any model of what a species at humanity's supposed level of development should have been capable of. 7 Velnorathi fleet groups were effectively neutralized, not by being destroyed, but by being cut off so completely from any support, any fuel, any communication, and any hope of relief that their commanders made the decision to power down non-essential systems and wait. 43 Velnorathi military installations across 11 star systems were struck with a precision that their own engineers, reviewing the damage afterward, described as impossible unless the attacking forces had detailed knowledge of the internal layout of each facility. They did have that knowledge. They had been collecting it for a long time. The orbital defense network above the Velnorathi homeworld had been considered by every military analyst in the galaxy to be impenetrable. It was the most advanced defensive installation in the known universe. 300 years of engineering and investment and continuous upgrading had gone into it. It went offline on a Wednesday, not because human forces overwhelmed it from the outside, because a set of infiltration programs that had been sitting dormant inside the network's own operating systems for 11 years received an activation signal and quietly and efficiently dismantled the network's coordination layer from the inside. No explosion, no dramatic assault, no massive fleet engagement. The lights simply went out. The Velnorathi engineers who found the infiltration code spent 3 days trying to determine when it had been installed. They eventually traced the entry point to a routine software maintenance update that had been applied to the network. 11 years ago, the update had come through a contractor system. The contractor system had been legitimate. The insertion had been buried so deep inside a standard patch package that it had passed every security scan without triggering a single alert for over a decade. The human intelligence officer who had designed that insertion had retired 2 years ago. She had been at a family gathering on Earth when the activation signal went out. She watched the news report about the Velnorathi defense network going offline, and she allowed herself a very small smile, and then she poured herself a drink and said nothing to anyone. Vorkathel was removed from the high command. It did not matter by then. The strike on Arvath Prime had not broken human morale the way he had predicted. It had done the opposite of that. It had taken a human population that was already behind its military and turned every single person on every single world into someone with a very specific and very focused feeling about how this war needed to end. Not a feeling of fear, a feeling of absolute commitment. The Velnorathi homeworld had its orbital defenses down, its fleet resupply networks were destroyed or captured, its communication infrastructure was barely functioning, its coalition was gone. Fewer than 20 species still maintained their vote in support of the decree of erasure, and most of those 20 were doing so quietly and hopping nobody noticed. High Command received a communication from Admiral Akafer. It was short. The Velnorathi Dominion will present a delegation at the following coordinates within 14 standard days to discuss terms of cessation. If no delegation is presented, humanity will treat the absence as a decision to continue and will proceed accordingly. The coordinates given were inside human-controlled space. Velshareth looked at the communication for a long time. He looked at his map. He looked at the defense network status. He looked at the fleet reports. He looked at the supply chain reports. Then he looked at his aide and said one sentence. Draft a response accepting the meeting. The aide began drafting. Outside the High Command building on the Velnorathi homeworld, for the first time in 300 years, the night sky above their capital city was dark. Because the orbital platforms that had always lit it like a second ring of stars were gone, and the species that had taken them down was waiting 14 days away, patient and prepared, as they had always been. As it turned out, they had always been. The Velnorathi delegation arrived at the meeting coordinates on the 13th day. They came in a single, unarmed diplomatic vessel, which was the requirement that had been set, and they docked at the human command station that had been established in the Tharvan system, a quiet stretch of space with no inhabited worlds and no strategic value, chosen specifically because it belonged to nobody. Ambassador Lyra Chen was waiting for them. She had not changed much in the months since she had walked out of the Grand Conclave. She looked the same as she had on that day. Dark hair pulled back, jacket pressed, face composed in that way she had of showing nothing that she had not decided to show. She was standing in the station's main meeting room when the Velnorathi delegation walked in, and she did not walk toward them or extend a formal greeting. She waited for them to sit down, and then she sat down across from them. The lead Velnorathi diplomat was a senior government official named Shalvarath. He had not been part of the high command. He was not a military figure, he was a diplomat of 30 years. And he had, for the record, abstained from the internal Velnorathi vote on the decree of erasure, because he had believed at the time that it was unnecessarily provocative. He sat across from Lyra Chen and looked at her for a moment. "You planned all of this," he said. "It was not an accusation, it was just an observation stated plainly. Before the decree was passed, you had already prepared." "We had options prepared," she said. "We hoped we would never use them." "Did you?" he said. She met his eyes. "Yes, we did." He believed her, and that belief made the conversation easier, because it meant they were both going to speak plainly, which was the only kind of conversation that was going to produce anything useful. The terms that Lyra Chen placed on the table were not what the galaxy had expected. Every military analyst, every political commentator, every government intelligence service that had been following the war had built models of what a human victory would look like. They expected the terms to be punishing. They expected territorial demands, massive reparations, forced disarmament of the Velnorathi fleet, possibly even the dissolution of the Velnorathi Dominion as a political entity. The terms were none of those things. The first term was full and formal acknowledgement by the Velnorathi Dominion that the decree of erasure had been an unlawful act under the sovereignty's own founding charter, which guaranteed the sovereignty of all member species regardless of membership tier. The second term was the return of all 12 contested colony systems to human control with full recognized sovereign status, meaning they were no longer contested. The third term was the permanent reclassification of humanity within the sovereignty to full member status, with equal voting rights in the upper chamber. The fourth term was a formal war crimes acknowledgement regarding the strike on Arvath Prime, entered into the permanent sovereignty record, with the names of the officers and officials who authorized it listed, and their responsibility stated clearly. The fifth term was a fund for Arvath Prime's reconstruction, contributed to by the Velnorathi Dominion over a period of 20 years. There were no demands for territory beyond what humanity had already held. There was no demand for fleet disarmament. There was no demand for the removal of Velnorathi leadership or the restructuring of their government. Shalvarath looked at the terms for a long time. "This is less than we feared," he said finally. "We are not interested in destroying you," Lyra Chen said. "We are interested in never having this conversation again from the lower chamber." He looked up at her. "You could have demanded more." "Yes," she said, "we could have." "Why didn't you?" She thought about the answer for a moment, not because she did not know it, but because she wanted to say it correctly. "Because the galaxy is watching how we end this," she said. "And what we do when we win matters more than what we did when we were fighting. Every species out there is deciding right now whether humanity is something they need to be afraid of permanently or something they can live next to. We want them to live next to us. We just want them to do it with accurate information about what we are." Shalvarath signed the terms on the 14th day. The news reached the Grand Conclave before the ink on the document was dry. The sovereignty called an emergency session to formally process the ceasefire terms and ratify the reclassification of humanity's membership status. The session was the most attended in the history of the conclave. Every species sent their full delegation. Every seat was filled. The camera drones were running in every corner of the chamber. Lyra Chen walked into the upper chamber for the second time. The first time she had walked out of it. This time she walked to the seat at the center of the highest tier, the seat that had always been occupied by a Velnorathi representative, the seat that was by tradition reserved for the presiding species of the session. She sat down in it. Nobody objected. Not because they were afraid, though some of them were, but because nobody in that room could construct a reasonable argument for why she should be sitting anywhere else. The session voted to ratify the ceasefire terms unanimously, including the Velnorathi delegation, which had no good reason to vote against terms they had already signed. The session then voted on the formal reclassification of humanity's sovereignty membership. The reclassification did not simply upgrade humanity from provisional to full member. The humans had proposed a new category, one that had no precedent in sovereignty history. They called it Founding Architect status. The formal definition of the category, as written into the Sovereignty Charter that day, was as follows. A Founding Architect member is a species that has demonstrated, through action and not declaration, the capacity to reshape the foundations of galactic civilization for the benefit of all member species. A Founding Architect member holds permanent upper chamber standing, carries veto authority over any decree affecting the rights of provisional members, and is recognized as a guarantor of the sovereignty's founding principles. The vote passed. Lyra Chen stood at the podium to address the full conclave after the vote. It was the same podium she had stood at months ago, when she had said 9 words, and walked out. The chamber was completely silent the way it had been silent then, but for a different reason. Then it had been shocked silence. Now it was listening silence. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not use notes. She said that humanity understood what the galaxy was feeling in that moment, and that humanity was not interested in making anyone feel small. She said that the Reckoning War had not been something humans had wanted, but that it had been something humans had prepared for because a species that could not protect itself, could not protect anything it valued. She said that the strike on Arvith Prime would not be forgotten, but that it would also not be used as a permanent reason to keep a wound open. Then she said the thing that got broadcast to every corner of the galaxy and quoted on 1,000 worlds for years afterward. We did not want this war. We did not start it. We ended it. That distinction will matter more than you know. Because we are not leaving this chamber. We are staying, and we will be here at this table when the next species decides it has found something weaker than itself to destroy, and we will remember, as we always have, exactly what was said and exactly who said it. The chamber was quiet for a long time after she finished. Not uncomfortable quiet, not frightened quiet. The particular quiet that comes when a very large room full of very intelligent beings all arrives at the same understanding at the same moment. The understanding was this. Humanity had been in the galaxy for decades. They had been mocked and restricted and underestimated and assigned to the lower chamber, and told in 1,000 small ways that they were not quite ready, not quite enough, not quite the kind of species that got to sit at the important tables. And the whole time, they had been doing something that no species had ever thought to ask about because the answer seemed too obvious to check. They had been preparing. Not preparing for war specifically. Preparing for the moment that turned out to be this one. And now they were in the highest chamber, and their ships were in the deep dark, and their plans were in the vaults, and their people were rebuilding Arvith Prime, and their ambassador was sitting in the presiding seat. And they were not going anywhere. Admiral Desmond Acaffer was on Earth when the ratification vote came through. He was sitting in a garden outside the Sol Defense Command headquarters, the part of the building that was above ground. Watching the sun go down, he got the confirmation on his personal terminal. He read it once. He put the terminal down. He looked at the sky for a while. Then he went inside to start writing the reports that would need to be filed now that the active phase was over. He was a man who believed in doing things properly. And there was a great deal left to do.